the big meta question of what is the meaning of life, it's not very in vogue these days. Things have kind of changed a bit. Certainly millennials tend to find the whole idea of one meaning of life a bit kind of restrictive. In fact, so we're told. It's much better and it's much more liberating if we just fashion our own meanings. That's where real happiness is to be found. You know, you craft your own life purpose. Like this is something I read online fairly recently. Somebody wrote, ultimately, there is no answer to the question of what is the meaning of life. You can only answer the question, what is the meaning of my life? And so you've got guys like Jerry Cohen. He's a professor at a university in Chicago who writes that although the universe is purposeless, our lives aren't. We make our own purposes and they're real. That just captures the philosophy of the day, that life is all about finding the real you. It's all about making your own individual meaning. You're free to decide. Here's Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion, that popular classic from a number of years ago, when he writes that the truly adult view is that our life is as meaningful, as full, and as wonderful as we choose to make it. Now, you kind of read that and you think, well, that sounds marvelous. It sounds liberating even. What a sunny way of viewing the world. He makes life sound like a Disney cartoon with everything in Technicolor. And so we kind of look to make our lives meaningful in lots of different ways. That's what everyone's searching for. If you do a search for books on Amazon about how to find your life purpose, you'll discover 151,928 different options to choose from. I wonder how you think about that question of the purpose of my life is to pursue our dreams, to make and spend as much money as possible, to support a cause, to stand up for something, to make a difference, to have a family. Whatever it is, your meaning in life is whatever you want it to be, and nobody can tell you otherwise. But for the purpose of this session, let me just push you a bit on where your search for meaning takes you. Because when we scratch below the surface, I think we see that the popular mantra of you make your own meaning is actually a pretty fragile way of living. For two reasons. Tim Keller writes about this in his popular book. He says that it's not reliable, and actually it's not rational. Firstly, it's not reliable. By that I mean, if your life is as meaningful as you make it, what happens when things inevitably go wrong? So take sport, for instance. Right? Sportsmen and women, they find it really hard to retire because the thing that they build their whole world around, that they'd found meaning in, has been taken away from them. So for instance, take Catherine Spencer. She was England women's rugby union captain. She retired way back in 2011. And this is her recounting how she felt when the team won the World Cup a few years later in 2014 after she'd retired. She said this. She said, I was at the top of my game. England captain, first choice, 63 caps. I knew what I was and what I was doing. I felt like I was at the top of my mountain. And then suddenly it feels as if you're not needed on the top of that mountain and you plummet to the bottom. You don't know where you're going or how to look up. Your whole being is almost taken away from you. She says that I started sobbing after England won the World Cup. I was happy that some of my best mates were out on the pitch, but I was absolutely devastated and gutted that this hadn't happened 4 years earlier. You see, her purpose in life was rugby, and she was an England rugby player, and so when that thing got taken away, then everything collapsed. That wasn't a reliable place to base her meaning. And so what happens when the things that we look to make our lives meaningful are taken away, or they break apart, or they fail you in some way? What happens when life doesn't feel full and wonderful? When that relationship that you were building your life around breaks down? When the cause that you support is no longer in vogue, when you get sick, when you can't carry on playing the sport you love or doing the job you enjoy, when you realize that you can't have kids, or that you're unlikely to get married, what then? If we're really honest, the things that we say give our lives true meaning are pretty fragile, and in the face of suffering, they often fold like a pack of cards. And then what do we do? Self-created meanings, they're not reliable. But secondly, and maybe more significantly, self-created meanings aren't rational. Now, just kind of go with me here, because even if you think all this Christianity stuff is a load of rubbish, let me at least ask you to be consistent in your thinking. I just want you to pause and ask yourself the question, what's it all for? Kids, charitable causes, a nice home out in the countryside, making people happy. What is the point? Maybe you land on something altruistic like, I'm just trying to make a difference. But here's the problem, okay? Here's Tim Keller writing on this very thing. He says, we have defined meaning in life as making a difference, but for the secular point of view, in the end, the universe gives you a final answer, nothing makes a difference. Now that is being logically consistent with a secular worldview, isn't it? Here's American philosopher Thomas Nagel on this. This will cheer you up. He writes that even if you produce a great work of literature which continues to be read thousands of years from now, eventually the solar system will wind down and collapse and all trace of your effort will vanish. The problem is that although there are justifications for most things, big and small, that we do within life, none of these explanations explain the point of your life as a whole. And he goes on and says it wouldn't matter if you'd never existed. And after you'd gone out of existence, it won't matter that you did exist. What a happy guy. Okay, so if this life is all there is, then if we're being consistent, if we're being rational, then Freddie Mercury's right, okay? Nothing really matters. There is no inherent meaning to anything. And so to say that there is meaning is actually to be irrational. But obviously, most of us don't like thinking like that. And so we fill our lives with noise and activity to stop those big questions breaking in on us. Not many of us are wandering around having an existential crisis and shouting, there's no point to anything. As the Australian author Mark Sayers puts it, he says, this is a culture in which we believe that ultimately life is meaningless, but we are insulated from the full horror of such a belief by the distracting and anesthetizing qualities of our public culture. Our existential angst is drowned out by cooking shows, discount airfares, smartphones, and celebrity gossip. Because I think we convince ourselves that if we fill our lives with enough distraction, we'll hopefully avoid having to deal with those bigger questions. We try not to let that big question of what's the purpose of life gain any traction. Which is why I think Keller's right when he says, when secular people seek to lead a meaningful life, they must have discipline to not think about the bigger picture. But here's the rub, okay? Whether we like it or not, at some point, either because we allow time to think about it, or especially perhaps when suffering comes, we're going to hit the fork in the road and we're going to think, what's it all for? What's the point? Now, maybe you've reached that moment. Maybe the big dreams that you had when you were in your 20s of what life was going to look like, maybe they just haven't quite materialized. Or even if they have, maybe you've got there and you're still left with this gnawing sense deep down of, is there really any point to this? TV shows like Mad Men capture this brilliantly, if you've seen it on Netflix. All the main characters on the show, they're on this kind of quest for meaning, for purpose. But in the end, after 7 seasons of suits and ties and sex and whiskey and drugs and promotions and bonuses and wives and younger wives and kids and holidays and parties, the viewer is just left haunted with this question of what's the point? That there must be something more than this. There is this kind of emptiness to it all. And if we dwell on it enough, we eventually end up where Tolstoy, the famous Russian author, where he lands, where he says one can only live while one is intoxicated with life. As soon as one is sober, it is impossible not to see that it's all a mere fraud and a stupid fraud. See what he's saying? That we can convince ourselves that we create our own meanings in life, but when we stop to really think about it, or when we face suffering, then the age-old question just starts to whisper in the back of our minds, what's the point of it all? What is the meaning of all this? Now, if you've arrived at this point and you feel utterly broken, that's okay. Okay, just keep watching. This is good. This is so good that we were made for something better. Now, I'm going to repeat a bit of what we looked at in session 1 because this is so important that we get this. Christians, and maybe some who've joined with you for this session, Christians believe that we were all created by God. Don't worry about how. That's not the point here. The point is that the Bible is clear as day that God made us. It's fundamental that is our starting point. And that means that meaning in life is found by knowing and being known by our Creator. As created things, we find our purpose in the one who created us. That follows, doesn't it? If there is a grand designer, and I realise that's a big if for some of you, but if there is, then it follows that the purpose of my life, what I was designed for, was to be in relationship with that designer in some way. But as we considered in our first session, we've rejected that. We look away from God. We shut him out. It's what the Bible calls sin. And then we either stand there and we ask the big existential questions of what's the point of it all, or we just crack on and we try and create our own meanings for our own lives. But do you see that actually both of those ways are errors, because both involve ignoring the one who made us and gives us meaning? And that's why we just feel haunted with this question of what's the meaning of life, because these meanings that we create for ourselves, they're just thin and they're fragile, they're not reliable, and they're not rational like we thought about. There's a book in the Bible called Ecclesiastes that describes this feeling in detail, all about a guy trying to find meaning in life. It's a fascinating book, worth reading. Have a listen to what the author writes. He says this, he says, "I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun." So here you've got a guy who's looked for meaning in all the usual places, right? He's built a big extension on the back of his house. He's made money, he's spent money, he's swiped right way more times than you can count. But for this guy who has looked to create meaning for himself in all of these places, at the end of the day, he's honest enough just to say that everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind. He's got to the point of saying, what's the point? Why? Because he's realized, or at least he does if you get to the end of the book, that outside of a relationship with God, life is fundamentally meaningless. Homes and relationships and material things, they're all good things, right? But when they are cut off from the giver, they fail to provide the meaning and purpose that we so desperately crave. And so at a deep level, we wrestle with this sense of purposelessness. So what's the answer? Well, somehow we've got to get back to our Creator. Somehow we've got to find that meaning again. But how do we do that? We've cut ourselves off from Him. How does this problem get fixed? We deserve to be cut off from God. We deserve to be separated from Him forever. We've turned our backs on Him. We've decided to try and find meaning away from Him. But, and this is the great news of the Bible, God sends His Son Jesus to swap places with us, to experience the meaninglessness of life without God in our place. And that is what happens when Jesus dies on the cross. And so we're just going to have a look at a short passage from the Bible now about what happens when Jesus dies. I don't know if you've ever looked at this account before, but this is a game changer. Okay, there are a few sentences from a true account of Jesus' life written by a guy called Mark. I'm going to read them out, and then we're just going to discuss them together where we are. Let me read this. This is from Mark chapter 10 and then chapter 15. "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." And then Mark 15. "At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 PM. And at 3 PM, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, 'Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani,' which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God."